My name is Katie Kenline. I'm a senior fellow here at the Institute for Faith and Freedom. I'm from Spokane, Washington, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our incredible speaker who's been on campus teaching a class for students, and we'd love to have him for the past couple months on campus. But Michael R. Pence was born in Columbus, Indiana. As a young boy, he had a front row seat to the American dream. The future vice president watched his mom and dad build everything that matters: a family, a business, and a good name. Vice President Pence set off for Hanover College, earning his bachelor's degree in history in 1981. While there, he renewed his Christian faith, which remains the driving force in his life. He later attended Indiana University School of Law and met the love of his life, Second Lady Karen Pence. After graduating, Vice President Pence practiced law, led the Indiana Policy Review Foundation, and began hosting The Mike Pence Show, a syndicated talk radio show and a weekly television public affairs program in Indiana. Along the way, he became the proud father to 3 children, Michael, Charlotte, and Audrey. In 2000, he launched a successful bid for his local congressional seat, entering the United States House of Representatives at the age of 40. On Capitol Hill, he established himself as a champion of limited government, fiscal responsibility, economic development, educational opportunity, and the U.S. Constitution. In 2013, Vice President Pence left the nation's capital when he was elected the 50th governor of Indiana. He brought the same limited government and low-tax philosophy to the Indiana State House. It was Indiana's success story, Vice President Pence's record of legislative and executive experience, and his strong family values that prompted President Donald Trump to select Mike Pence as his running mate in July 2016. The American people elected President Donald Trump and Vice President Pence on November 8, 2016. Vice President Mike Pence remains grateful for the grace of God, the love and support of his family, and the blessings of liberty that are every American's birthright. Please join me in welcoming Vice President Mike Pence.
Well, thank you, Katie, and you read that just the way I wrote it. Although I asked her, I said, that looked like the shorter one. Katie is just emblematic of students I've had the great privilege alongside with President McNulty to be teaching here at Grove City College, and you could give her, so well representative of the incredible students here, a big round of applause. These Grovers are amazing. Thank you, Katie. Great job. Actually, Katie knows me well enough to know the introduction I prefer is a little bit shorter. I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican, in that order. And I have to tell you, I'm adding that to the list, something that's been a great honor for me. To all the patrons of Grove City College and members of the board, members of the faculty, I am honored to be a professor at Grove City College. Thank you all. And I know you've had an incredibly engaging and stimulating day. I feel a little bit humbled to be following the speakers that you've heard from today, but I'm going to try and do my level best. This 2025 annual conference for faith and freedom here at Grove City has become an enormously important tradition, and I'm grateful for you all being a part of it. And particularly, I was intrigued by the theme of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I know you'll have a different movie that you're screening tonight that I'm excited about as well. But I don't know about the rest of you. I always loved that movie. I really did. It's a story of an ordinary American armed only with his ideals and his values and the beliefs of the American founding to go to Washington, D.C. and get the kind of reception most people get when they bring those things to Washington, D.C. But there's something about that movie that's just very modern. If you go back after this conference, maybe avail yourself of it, take a look at it again, because it just bristles off the screen. 25 years ago, when I arrived in Washington, D.C., after many lessons learned in politics that I wrote about in my autobiography, it took me, as Katie knows and the other students here know, it took me about 12 years to get to Washington, D.C. And God had lessons for me to learn, humility to learn along the way. But by the time that I got there, I can honestly say I felt a little bit like that man from the heartland in the movie. It was humbling for me to come there. A lifelong love affair with the Constitution of the United States. I'd been a student of the American founding since my days at a little college, very much like Grove City College. I often thought of that Bible verse, who am I and who is my family, Lord, that you've brought us this far? I never imagined God would lead me someday to not only be a leader in the Congress, but to be the governor of my home state. But before I get going, let me thank all the friends from Pennsylvania and around the country. Thank you for the privilege of being your vice president. It was the greatest honor of my life. And to be in the company of some people that I deeply respect. Literally, the people that you've heard from today are folks that have been friends of mine, but also people that I deeply admire. Michael Medved, from years ago when he wrote his famous book, Hollywood versus America, I think has been one of the most compelling conservative voices in the United States of America. And Michael, I want to congratulate you. Another great friend of mine who I actually knew when he was in the White House back when I was pretty regularly annoying the Bush administration. Mostly over spending, never over the policies that Mark worked on. But he's emerged now, I think, as one of the most important voices for a strong national defense and American leadership on the world stage. You heard about it today. But I want to thank Mark Thiessen publicly for your strong stand for freedom. And I can honestly tell you, I'm a little bit of a fanboy for Paul Kengor. I don't know about the rest of you. Yeah, you can just applaud that if you want. So when the president of Grove City College invited me to come over, he said, I'd like you to come over and talk a little bit about doing this. I said, great. And he said, I don't know if you know, but the institute is Paul Kengor. And I said, Paul Kengor? Is he going to be there? I'll tell you what, someone who has chronicled not only one of my heroes without any peer, but Paul's just emerged as one of the most important voices in America in the written word. Paul, we appreciate you, and God bless you. And second to last, whenever I visited Pennsylvania, when I was governor of Indiana, people thought that I dyed my hair to look more like Tom Corbett. You heard from him today. I will tell you, a man of integrity, a leader, someone that made this state stronger and more prosperous and was admired by his peers across America. Join me in thanking Governor Tom Corbett. Would you please? And I know he's going to get a lot of these accolades over the course of the next several months. He deserves every single one of them. I met Paul McNulty when we used to go to church together in suburban Washington, D.C. Our wives both spent time teaching and being administrators at a small Christian school there. I knew him as a man of integrity then, and I must tell you that to see the impact that he's had on this 150-year-old institution, and in so many ways, if it could have been done, Paul McNulty stepped in and reinforced the foundation of Christian education and Christ-centered education at Grove City College. Would you all mind getting on your feet and thanking Paul McNulty for 10 years of consequential leadership? Oh, Brenda came in. Well, on behalf of President McNulty and all the team here, I do want to thank all of you for your support of Grove City College. I'm incredibly honored to be a part of this institution. And tonight I want to speak to you a little bit about the case for limited government. That's the topic Paul gave me anyway. Actually, I think the case for limited government is the case for the Constitution, which I think now more than ever is a case that we need to be making as America faces challenges at home and abroad. And I will tell you, I couldn't be prouder of the accomplishments of the Trump-Pence administration in our 4 years. I mean, we rebuilt our military, we revived our economy, we unleashed American energy. But maybe of greatest consequence of all is in the midst of all of that, we appointed more than 300 conservative judges to our courts at every level, lifetime appointments, including Amy Coney Barrett, who's from Indiana. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and helped to strengthen the majority that gave America a new beginning for the right to life. I was honored to be a part of the deliberations during our administration. I remember I got to do the last interviews for all three of the nominees. And when I'd get to the end of this, and Mark Thiessen knows this story, when I get to the end of the private interviews in the first round, when Neil Gorsuch was appointed, I would always ask the potential appointees to the Supreme Court, Paul, if the president didn't choose you, who among the other people that are being talked about should he choose? And in that first round, 7 out of 9 all said Neil Gorsuch. And to see the progress that we've made with this new majority, not only giving America a new beginning for the right to life, but also strengthening religious liberty in America, and a Supreme Court decision that I think over time will be of enormous consequence in restraining the administrative state, overturning the Chevron deference that had been on the law for so many years. But it's that court that is the vouchsafe of the Constitution. And I would tell you that during our years in the White House, I'm proud to say that virtually every day the President and I saw eye to eye on that mission. When you are sworn into office at virtually every level in the country, whether you're a police officer, whether you're a state legislator, whether you're a vice president or president, you put your hand on a Bible, you raise your right hand, and you swear an oath. And they're almost all the same. Support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And it ends with a prayer. So help me God. You'll see a movie tonight that I'm tempted to skip class and stick around for, about George Washington. But it may interest you to know that the presidential oath did not include the phrase, so help me God. It was added by our first president and has been repeated by everyone that's followed. But it's a sacred oath, and it's a commitment to a Constitution, which I can testify is an oath I took by God's grace with great seriousness. Leaving the Constitutional Convention, there's a great story that Benjamin Franklin encountered a very prominent woman in Philadelphia, which is here in Pennsylvania, right? And she said after the Constitutional Convention, summer 1787, "What kind of government did you create?" And Benjamin Franklin replied spontaneously, "A republic if you can keep it." And since that time in 1787, pushing up on 2.5 centuries, we've managed to do it. But I would submit to you as we gather here today at this important conference, that the vision of limited government enshrined in the Constitution of the United States is facing new challenges in this time. Over the previous 4 years during the Biden administration, we saw a president who routinely disregarded the guardrails and limitations of the Constitution. The president swears an oath to see that the laws are faithfully executed, and it was an administration that disregarded the laws of immigration and about our borders. Congress appropriates and spends and approves, and we saw a president, though, with a stroke of a pen trying to eliminate student loan obligations of students all across the country, even though he and his predecessor had said that they couldn't do it. And after the Supreme Court rejected his unconstitutional action, he did it again. And then, of course, I don't have to tell believers in the room about the steady assault on religious liberty and values that we've witnessed that have only been vouchsafed by that conservative majority on the Supreme Court. And today, I would submit to you that while our nation is headed back on the path of freedom, and it's a time of great hope and promise, and a great hope and promise that I share, with wars and rumors of wars abroad, with economic uncertainty here at home, kind of reminds me of a story that Ronald Reagan used to love to tell, Paul. Apparently a farmer was taking a cow into town. He put a cow in the back of the truck. He had his dog in the front seat of the truck. They got into an accident. He was going through an intersection, and the cars all got torn up, and the cow and the dog ended up in one ditch, and the farmer and the truck ended up in the other ditch. And when the farmer woke up, he recovered. This thing ended up in court, like these things do. And when the farmer was being cross-examined in the midst of the lawsuit, he said, "Sir, isn't it true that you encountered a sheriff at the scene of the accident?" He said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Well, isn't it true that when the sheriff asked you how you felt, you said you never felt better in your life?" And he said, "Well, I reckon I did." And he said, "No further questions." And at that point, his own lawyer got up, and he did what you lawyers call redirect. And he said, "Sir, would you care to explain the circumstances under which you made that comment?" He said, "Yeah, I reckon I would." He said, "There was this terrible traffic accident." He said, "About the time I woke up, the sheriff was standing on the other side of the road looking down at my cow. And that cow was all busted up, so he just put his revolver next to the cow's head and he put it down. And he walked down and he seen my dog in the ditch. And that dog's back was broke and poor thing was lame, and so he just lowered his gun and he put the dog out of its misery. And then he walked across the road and looked down at me and said, 'And how are you feeling?' And I said, 'I never felt better in my life.'" One of my favorites. But honestly, I never felt better in my life because while some people argue that the ideals and the principles and the structure of the Constitution belong to history, are outdated to our time, I submit to you, far from being outdated, I think the Constitution holds the key to solving some of the greatest challenges that we face in the modern era. And simply by putting it into practice again, vigorously and with integrity, we can find our way forward in these divided times. So I'll make the case for the Constitution tonight and touch on two issues that bear upon both of our lives: spending and the economy. I mean, I know there's going to be people that say that America's too divided today to tackle the issue of $37 trillion in national debt, too divided to modernize and rebuild a military fitted to the challenges of an ever-dangerous world, too divided to protect the God-given liberties enshrined in our founding documents. But I think, look, the truth is, a proper understanding of the American founding is that we've always had our differences. We truly have. It's one of the reasons why in our founding documents we aspired to create a more perfect union. And I think the structure of the Constitution has provided the opportunity for us to do that. The Constitution of the United States is a framework for solving intractable challenges. Let me submit to you that the separation of powers, the checks and balances, the protection of minority opinions all lead to the kind of deliberation that results in principled compromise that makes for steady, principled progress in a free society. It always has. And it will again. Now, I have some practical experience in this area. In 2005, a lot of you remember, Hurricane Katrina came ashore with a vengeance You remember those days, Mark. It's remarkable. I mean, the loss of lives, I think more than 2,000 people were swept away in that storm. Billions of dollars in damages. And I will tell you, I was a member of Congress at the time. I'd been there for about 5 years. And at the time, I was the leader of the House Conservative Caucus. It was about the time I got to do Michael Medved's radio show for the first time. But I remember everybody in Congress knew that we were going to have to rebuild the Gulf Coast. We had to provide the resources to support it. But I and House conservatives also believed we had to figure out a way to pay for it, right? The headlines today in Washington, D.C., Congress took a good step forward in starting us back on a path of fiscal responsibility. This was one of those moments where we were talking about spending billions of dollars, and House conservatives said, where are we going to get the money? I remember talking to a reporter one day, and I said, back in Indiana, if the storm hits, a tree falls on your house, first thing you do is tend to people that are hurt, clean up the mess, rebuild, then you figure out how you're going to pay for it. And Washington, D.C. does 3 out of 4 of those things really well, but oftentimes never even gets to the last question. Anyway, I remember we kind of stepped up, and boy, were we castigated for even bringing up the idea that we should find a way to pay for these things, because we were heartless and we didn't care about people in the Gulf. We said, no, we fully support the resources. We just want to make sure that we find the funding for it. The Republican leadership at the time on Capitol Hill was very irritated with us. A friend of mine named Tom DeLay back in the day, I remember Tom said, well, show me the offsets. So House conservatives, as they still mischievously do, we decided we would, and developed a list of $500 billion in cuts. The truth of the matter is, with great credit to President George W. Bush, who Mark served with such distinction, we managed to gather together just about 2 months later in February of 2006 and signed the Deficit Reduction Act that George Will would call the largest real cut in federal spending since 1997. Literally reduced tens of billions of dollars, offsetting the entire cost. I call it kind of an early Doge, if you will. But it was an example, I would submit to you, that was an example of Congress working and the president working. And the way that we can tackle a $37 trillion national debt is not to look at a single branch of government and say, solve it. As much as I know Elon Musk very well. I was the chairman of the National Space Council, worked with him very closely during my time as vice president. And he's a very interesting guy. Very smart, very sincere. And I welcome what he's doing. But the reality is what is being proposed by the Doge needs to be legislated now and needs to come before the president. That's what the Constitution contemplates. The truth is, what one president does by executive order, as we learned under Joe Biden, another president can undo by executive order. But the law is the law. You pass budgets, as Congress is now, Mark reflected today on campus, Congress is now poised to do at a significant level, extending those tax cuts that we passed in 2017, but also find ways to pay for them with budget reductions and reforms. That's what the Constitution contemplates. I mean, I truly believe that reviving the role of each branch of government contemplated in the Constitution could have spared us the economic uncertainty of the past week. Now, 1 week ago, we all know that President Trump announced a series of global tariffs against friend and foe at an unprecedented scale. Let me say from my heart, having led much of the effort in our administration to get tough on China, I welcome the strong tariffs and strong actions against communist China. But I hold that tariffs are taxes that are ultimately passed along to consumers. And when we're dealing with allied nations, I like to say free trade with free nations, because ultimately American consumers can pay the price. But that's why I welcomed the President's decision yesterday to pause most of the tariffs that were imposed. But the truth is, if we had followed the founders' intent in the Constitution, the stops and starts that your 401k experienced in the last week would not have happened. And let me explain why. The truth is, our founders had grave concerns about unilateral authority broadly, but especially when it came to tariffs and taxes. I mean, you all remember the Revolutionary War. You'll see a great film tonight. Much of it was about taxation without representation. In fact, you need look no further than the Declaration of Independence to find that our founders had a very dim view of tariffs. They castigated King George in the Declaration of Independence for, quote, cutting off our trade and, quote, imposing taxes on our trade without consent. And so when the Congress fashioned the new government after the Articles of Confederation faltered in the Constitution, we find in Article 1, Section 8, these words: the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. That's not to say the president doesn't have a role. And let me be very clear. What the actions President Trump took are fully within the law. Because in the 1960s and the 1970s and since, Congress has been delegating tariffing authority to the executive branch. But I rise tonight to suggest to you that the original outline was better, and that Congress would do well for the future of the country, the future of our economy, to reclaim that authority. Now, the president always ought to have emergency authority. I mean, Alexander Hamilton said that our Constitution contemplated an energetic executive. And I can tell you, I worked right next to one for 4 years. The president needs to be able to act. In the event of an emergency, the president needs to be able, including with regard to tariffs and economic penalties, to move against those threatening America's interests, our people, or our allies. But with regard to the broader tariff authority, tariffs applied to allies with whom we trade, I would submit to you that the founders would have the Congress step into that. I welcome that Senator Chuck Grassley, who's a friend of mine from Iowa, conceded this point just last week. He said the Congress has yielded too much authority to the executive branch in the last 40 years and should reclaim it. And there'll be a time for an important debate over that. So whether it's dealing with the national debt or taxes or tariffs, I believe the pathway to stable growth, preservation of our liberties, protecting future generations from a mountain range of debt can be found in the Constitution of the United States. And I hope in this conference today and in the days ahead, you'll become a part of that conversation. Because the truth is, there was something of God's grace in the summer of 1787. I believe it with all my heart. There was genius in that room that looked at the experience of history, and in the very same year that France was going through its own revolution, we created a form of government that did not collapse into despotism like we saw in the failure of the French Revolution, but it created the freest and most prosperous nation in the history of the world. But I submit to you, it's the ideals in the Declaration and the framework of the Constitution that accomplish that. And the truth is, if we continue in one administration after another, in one degree after another, from the Congress or the courts or from successive administrations, to walk away from principles enshrined in the Constitution, we won't just lose our national wealth, we'll lose our country. That being said, as I close, let me say I'm confident of better things. because I have faith. The one thing I learned traveling across this country as vice president and in my years as governor was the American people are the most idealistic, innovative, resilient, generous, caring, strong people the world has ever known. And I know that someday soon we're going to have government as good as our people again. I think we're on that track now. But this is the playbook. This is the template, the Constitution of the United States. You know, in Frank Capra's classic film, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, you see an everyday American who believed in the ideals of our founders, that in that time, as too often has been in my 25 years around public life, and some people have forgotten. Some people have thought we're antiquated. But he took a stand. He kept his oath. He kept the promises he'd made to the kids at that boys' camp he had come to represent in his hometown. The Bible says he keeps his oath even when it hurts. Sometimes it does. But the uplifting thing in that movie was that people came around. Even the most hardened and cynical characters in Washington, D.C., in that old Frank Capra film came around. Once they were reminded about the things that have made this country strong and prosperous and free. I have faith in the American people. I have faith in our leaders that we'll do the same in our time, if we'll but stand firm. And finally, I have that faith shared by so many in this room and so well reinforced by Grove City College and your extraordinary factory. I have faith that he who has guided this experiment in freedom from its very inception guides us still to this very day. The Bible tells us where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And that means when we will embrace the ideals that define the American founding, if we will stand firm on the foundations that have been poured by generations before and defended by countless generations of heroes, that we'll make his work on this earth our own. And when you're working at God's side, when you're working on freedom's side, you can be sure freedom always wins. Thank you very much. God bless you. And thank you for the privilege of being a part of Grove City College.